Hi, everyone. I'm here today, joined by HD Moore, one of the legends and icons of the cybersecurity world. I'm Jessica, head of research here at AGI House. And HD, I feel like you're somebody with, no need for an explanation, but would you like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. I've been around at least security for, I guess, almost 30 years now. Started off, hacking all the things as a kid back in the BBS days. Got pulled into kind of internet fun times before it all became very illegal. And then from then on, it was been, security companies, consulting. So kind of mixing between like doing a bunch of work, hacking banks, doing things like that kind of in the field, and then building a product to solve the problems I saw while I was a consultant, and then going back to consulting again and vice versa. So I'm on kind of the one of those legs right now, still in the product world. We just announced that we're being acquired, so it's been pretty exciting on that front. But yeah, it's been nice. It's nice being able to like take the stuff you see in the real world, go build a product, and repeat.
A lot of very, very exciting things happening in HD's life. So we're very grateful that he's able to join us today. And I guess like maybe just to start off before we dive into like a lot of the work that you've been doing, we can do a little bit of a personal background. I feel like you're somebody with so many stories. Obviously you might have heard of Ishi through Metasploit and other things that he's worked on, but I think at age like 13 or something, you have like a fun story where you're like crawling into school through the windows to play video games. It's a very scrappy kind of nature. Can you talk about bit more about that kind of childhood grow up and how that connects to a lot of things, cowboy-esque style things you're doing today.
Yeah, I mean, grew up fairly poor, moved around a lot, and so it was all in a new school, all this new area. I didn't really have computers or anything like that, so a lot of dumpster diving. My parents and I would go behind dumpsters to get food, but also to get electronics, also to resell stuff. And, through that process, that's kind of how I got into computing is like finding a hard drive and then finding a chassis and then finding this, eventually building a computer out of the parts. But I really love computers just because like it was the one thing I felt like wasn't particularly good at it, but I knew it was the only reason why I wasn't good at it was my fault. It wasn't like someone didn't like the way I was doing it. It's like what I typed was wrong and therefore it didn't work. So I like the kind of, I guess the control, the concept that like, as long as you get things right on the code, then things actually work correctly on the screen, and that's it. That's your relationship with you and the hardware and the application is what you can build and what it can do, and not someone else's opinion.
Yeah, that's a very humble way to put it. I'm also curious, I guess, what was your most fun, I guess, discovery while you were looking around collecting things?
All kinds of stuff. I mean, I think probably it's like 10 or 11. I was dumpster driving behind some pharmacy and found they threw away all their candy that had expired. It was like 30 pounds of candy.
Oh
And,
my god.
being a 10-year-old with 30 pounds of candy, I did what everyone else did, took it to school and sold it for like $1 a candy bar for the next like years. And that was kind of my early entrepreneurial was, selling expired candy from a dumpster to my schoolmates. But so an example of kind of like just what I grew up doing. But the computer side was fun. Like I found like a floppy disk for the game Manhunter in like 1994 or something like that. And it took me about 7 years to have a computer that I actually play it. It just took that long to finally scrap it all together. But, I'd, kind of mentioned I would break into the school early in the morning to play around with computers before class started. I'd go hang out with my friends. They'd fall asleep. I'd take over their computers all night and war dial up the city. My mom was a medical transcriptionist, which was amazing in the 90s because we had 4 phone lines, with 2 of them being ISDN. So I could war dial not just like the normal phone lines, but actually war dial ISDN lines. And so you'd find all kinds of like mainframes and the FM radio tower, at one point, we're turning the HVAC on and off at Kmart, things like that. So just general hoodlummery in my teenage years. And somehow in the middle of all that, after going through like 6 high schools and finally graduating through sketchy terms, I got a job offer on Pound Frac on FNet, like the IRC network, by someone in the military working for the Air Force out of Germany saying, hey, this company down in San Antonio is hiring at the base. You should go interview there. I was like, okay. So I shaved the mohawk, found a polo shirt, drove my truck down there, which had no AC, which didn't have a clutch. So you had to push start the thing. Generally, pretty janky, but I got there. I somehow got the job, and that was the beginning of it. So I spent about 6 months doing weird exploit dev for the military, and then from there, I started my first company, and just been doing that since.
That's incredible. A lot of things to talk about there, your mohawk being one of them. But I'm also curious to just to jump forward in the timeline too. I think a lot of that, late night scrappy nature also describes, I guess, how you've talked about running runZero. You've mentioned, not sleeping for very extended periods of time. You've mentioned not being away from the servers for long periods of time as well. So I guess, how's that been?
It's getting better. I mean, it's nice to have a company now, but for the first, I think, 2.5 years, I ran the company solo, which means like my, kiddo is getting LASIK surgery. And I swear, like right in the middle of the surgery, the servers go down. And so I'm like, I've got my laptop sitting in the waiting room looking at the screen as his eyeballs being chopped up and then trying to figure out how to like, bring the servers back online. Or many times where like I'm driving from Austin to Dallas and there's like an ops alert and we have to get out of the car, run around, swap places. I jump on the laptop, start trying to fix it as we get there. So and by the time I got to about a million ARR and about 100 customers, I was like, I haven't been able to sleep in like 3 weeks because it's always something, right? Support tickets, whatever. And so we started hiring. So that raised money, raised a seed round, an A round, an A1 about 2 years ago. And, we grew pretty big. We managed to get to roughly 20 million ARR. And yeah, it's been good. So we have a pretty solid team, but it's all very hands on still. Like we don't have a support team. Every ticket coming in from a customer goes directly to an engineer, and that's it. Like it's really good to make sure that your team who's building the software knows the problems that your customers have. And there's no way to, enforce that accountability besides putting an engineer in front line to the support. So if the customer doesn't like the way you build something, you'll hear about it and you'll have to go fix it. So it's a very kind of direct level of accountability and responsibility to our customers. And customers love it, of course, because we don't just put it on the stack and forget about them. And we love it because we're able to fix a problem with the product before it becomes like a widespread thing people hate and don't want to talk to us about.
It's incredible. It's a lot of work, but obviously it's paid off a lot. And I actually also wanted to ask, so obviously runZero has customers, it's commercial, it's a bit of a departure from, for example, Metasploit, which was meant to be, open source. So what has that switch been like between these two experiences?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I really loved on Metasploit was being able to work with lots of people, like across countries, across time zones, be able to just like hack around with cool hackers and stuff. That was fun, and you can still do that with open source today. I think Metasploit was kind of at a special time when things were just kind of in this big kind of a David versus Goliath mode of security, trying to make exploit something that wasn't a criminal activity. But since then, now there's tons of open source, tons of open source security. Like you can jump into one of 30 different open source projects. They're all actively building cool stuff. And, it's runZero is kind of a bet. Like at the time, started the company, originally called like Rumble Network Discovery, was right around folks started doing SSPL and like the business licenses and AGPL3, where it really became like instead of being open core, they kind of went the other direction. They were really trying to like giving up on open source core and really trying to sell add-on services, support, whatever. So Metasploit was always open core. We had a BSD or MIT license, I forgot, for the core of it. And then we had Metasploit Pro, which kind of sat on top and added automation and features, things like that. runZero's come the opposite. We started off with kind of a closed source core, and then over the years, we've been contributing to libraries, packages, other things kind of around the peripheral and trying to help everybody else level up. So we've been working with, we have some patches into the Nuclei engine. We maintain a separate tree of Nuclei templates. We run a bunch of little open source projects to do bizarre things in the Go ecosystem, stage auditing, crypto library alternatives, things like that. So I'd love to do more open source, but it's always a challenge of like, can you even ship our product, let alone ship there's funny enough, it's actually harder to ship open source code than it is a commercial product, right? Because very few people see your commercial code. Everybody sees your open source code. So you have to be a lot more careful. But it has paid off too. I mean, treating our commercial build as if it was going to be open source at some point, just in terms of like cleanliness, license auditing, things like that, has made things like, going through diligence for potential acquisition a lot easier because we've already done all the hard work of it ahead of time.
Yeah, definitely a lot of work to work on open source things. So I can only imagine the level of quality that you're used to. And I guess like going a bit into more broader stance. Earlier today, HD gave a keynote speech to our audience here at Asian Identity Build Day, and what you talked about was very interesting. The idea of a shadow era, and kind of how exploits have changed from the past 2 decades or more. For the audience here, would you like to give a quick takeaway overview of this thesis?
Sure. Yeah, if you go back to the 90s, there's like 20 people in the world that could break into anything they wanted to. That was just it. Like the vendors didn't know about it. They didn't know about the vulnerabilities. The exploits were being treated kind of on the cool kids clubs, so it's IRC and so on. And if you're one of those 20 people, you could pretty much break any company you want to. And that's kind of just where things were. Fast forward about 10 years, 15 years, we got this huge security industry selling product to defend, detect, et cetera. And we kind of sort of thought we had our eye on it, right? People were looking at, well, what's being exploited? Okay, I'll focus on that. But we got to a situation where like everybody was being given a list of things to fix that they had no ability to actually do. Like they're giving a list of like 5,000 things. And so the last 10 years have been very much, well, which of these 10,000 things should we fix? And my view as a security person is like, well, you can't pick. You have to do all of them, right? Like those are not all optional. Those are all things you need to do one way or another to figure it out. But the way the rest of the world has looked at this is saying, well, we need to prioritize what exploits or what vulnerabilities will be most likely to be exploited. you know, that may have worked for a short period of time. It no longer works today. Generally, what's happened is that we've gone from vulnerabilities being sort of kind of, you get 100-ish per Tuesday, Patch Tuesday from Microsoft. You've got a few day window to patch before things get exploited. Like all those timelines have collapsed. Now that folks have these great LLM tools, you're able to actually find exploits and exploit them prior to the vendor even knowing about it at scale, even if you're not one of those 20 cool kids. So we've kind of gone back to the same world again of where we don't know what people have exploits for against our environment. We know that if we've got some kind of like, slightly unknown, obscure technology component, it's more than likely going to be exploitable, and we just don't know anything about it yet. So while there's been a lot of work by organizations like, of course, the Anthropics and OpenAI with Daylight and Daybreak and Glasswing, there's now a cross industry effort that has started called Athena, which is pretty similar. But the idea is to let's go just burn down the open source fallen tree as fast as we can. And this is actually not too different from what happened when IDA Pro and tools like reverse engineering tools really became broadly commercial in the early 2000s. We went from people being able to like barely figure out how to patch diff to get an exploit to becoming a like just common thing people did every exploit Tuesday. Sorry, every Microsoft Tuesday was exploit Wednesday. Now they've got to this mode of like LLM being able to find bugs so good. Like you have to assume that if there's a bug anywhere in your stack, someone can find it if they want to. And you also can't depend on someone like or an organization like CISA with a K known exploited vulnerabilities list being put on the list for you to exploit it, because these vulnerabilities are often going to be targeted directly at you and you only. So we're back to a situation where like you'll be attacked with a vulnerability that almost no one else knows about. It may not be used against anybody else. So by the time that you're hit with it, it's not like there'll be a signature for it or known defense or YAML or a YAR rule for it. You're effectively going to be in a situation where unless you happen to catch it during that one quick moment, you'll never see it again. And so, in a lot of ways, we're kind of back to the basics. Like the only way to defend against that is to assume breach, like assume that someone will get into each layer of your environment, figure out where they can go from there. The defense in depth, really good monitoring. So it's kind of all back to the basics again. We're definitely no longer in a situation where we can depend on mainstream cybersecurity products to really make a difference in our ability to defend.
Yeah, it's a lot of the Wild West that we're returning back to, which is very exciting. And I guess there's a few things that you mentioned that we wanted to pick on here. So I guess in maybe not so direct terms that you were referring a bit to 0 days. And also just the idea that CVEs are no longer going to be comprehensive, or they were never comprehensive, but they're not even going to be a good basis necessarily to work off of in this new era. So I guess like to cybersecurity experts out there who are maybe still working on a more traditional mental model, what sort of things would you tell them to change their mind framework about? And what are the challenges that you've already foreseen in this like change of framework and the creating the solution? And kind of where do you see, this whole industry kind of changing and evolving over the next few years? Like what questions do you have to tackle?
Yeah, a really good metric for whether your security program is going to survive is it based on CVEs? If the only way you can track vulnerability in your environment is with the CVE, it's already too late, right? There's something like a couple 100,000 vulns that are stacked up right now that don't even have a CVE allocated to them, and probably will never get a CVE at this point. And given the changes we've seen with NVD, the kind of chaos within CISA as the agency, CVEs and the KEB list will not be there to save you. And so we need some other identifier. Like there's now the EU CVE, there's these other, or EU CVD, there's these other kind of like multinational and organizations that are no longer CVE to help track this stuff. But at the end of the day, like weirdly enough, GitHub security advisors have actually become like the most useful, unique identifier for most vulnerabilities. And there's way more of those than there are CVEs. And that just gives you an idea of like, we're kind of in a situation where like if you're using CVE as your numbering scheme, it's already too late. Like you're not going to catch up anytime soon. And so if your program is currently based on CVSS scores or CVEs, like it's not going to work. You're going to have to start over and say, what's a new way to identify stuff? And given that there's so much of it ahead, and we're probably looking at a year or two of just ridiculously high rates of vulnerability identification disclosure, I kind of suggest people go the other direction. Instead of looking at what's the vulnerability flow look like, just assume there's going to be vulnerabilities and look at your whole tech stack again and say, okay, what is the technology we use at the edge? What do we use to step in? How do we determine if this got breached, that got breached? If someone got to this particular point of our network, where else could they go? So kind of just getting back to basics again, because again, you're not going to be able to stop the avalanche, right?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I think something that's been, obviously you're talking about this so passionately. Something that's been interesting too. I think at some point you were brought into like an RSEC talk, in which you were like playing the role of a bit more like a skeptic in terms of like AI exploitation. Correct me if I'm wrong there. But I guess like how have you kind of flipped the switch? I mean, how you think. And are there still threads where you're, I guess, challenging this like thesis where there's nuance or tension?
Sure. I mean, I think of the funniest way I found to refer to like whether people like AI or not, especially if they were skeptics early on, is there's this great book called "Flowers for Algernon" about a gentleman who, I mean, some folks may have read it, but essentially somebody who is not particularly smart, and they get a medical treatment that makes them smarter and smarter and smarter, and they become so miserable the smarter they get. And then you kind of see the whole arc of like getting up to the point where they realize how terrible everything is, and then they slowly get dumber and dumber and dumber again, and everything kind of ends up happy again. And it's a little bit like that. Like at some point, I think for myself, my friends, the point where we decided that AI is useful was when it was smarter than we were. Like when we went from like, I know this thing is obviously wrong by looking at it to being no longer to tell that it's obviously wrong. And that's dangerous though, because it's relative. Like just because I now feel more confident in, let's say, Opus 4.8 doesn't mean it's any better. It just means that it's beyond my level of ability to determine to detect if it's incorrect or not, right? So Fortunately, there's like lots of good tooling and harnesses now that do kind of, correctness checks and adversarial reviews of what you're doing. But there really was a tipping point, I think, at the beginning of this year where a lot of like the security nerds finally acknowledged that the models were getting better at it than they were. And at that point, you kind of saw a big flip right around Opus 4.6, Opus 4.7 timeframe. And that's really when everyone kind of like went from heavy skeptics on the cybersecurity side to, okay, this is going to change the world in a lot of ways and we need to catch up. There's also kind of another piece with, I think, AI in general, which is difficult. So if you spent your last 2 years building harnesses and tooling around particular models, it may all be trash. Like unfortunately, like the things that you spent 2 years building a harness around, you can now do with a single prompt in Claude 4.8 or Fable 5 whenever it gets back in the market, right? So the things that we built to make our not so smart models do a lot of good work are now effectively obsolete with new models. And so like I'm kind of in the position of like I don't have to care about it. I'm going to use what's available. It's tech. We'll use it however we want to, and maybe a year or two it'll settle down to the point where I feel like it's something you can build on. But I don't feel like it's at the moment it feels like you're building a castle on someone else's land. And just like the cloud providers ate a huge portion of the early cloud business and took it themselves with hosted engines, hosted whatever, forky open source. We can already see today that the large frontier model providers are about to eat everything. So everybody who's built a application security auditing tool built on an Opus backend or OpenAI backend is not particularly happy about the fact that now those companies are offering the exact same thing, just like Amazon did for database servers. So give it a year or so, and we're likely to see the main frontier providers really take a big bite out of the entire security market. And we all joke like, "Oh, what's happening to AppSec? But it won't happen to my special area." It's like, no, it's going to happen to all of us, right? So
Yeah, there's
the
no
only
exception there.
the good news though is like the open models are actually getting much a lot better too. So there's a really funny Open Router announced it earlier this week. But after Fable 5 got taken off the market by all the government drama, they said, hey, we can actually get better results than Fable 5 just by gluing together GLM, DeepSeek 4, and like Gemma. And so they took like multiple models, like fused them together as they call it, created a single wrap around it. And we're actually getting better results for like a tenth the price. So for all the gatekeeping that the frontier models think they're doing, it doesn't really matter. The open models have done close enough at this point that, OpenAI can say you do or do not get access to your model and no one has to care. They'll just use other models that are just as good by combining them. So we're starting to get to the point where the open source models are now really starting to kick, the open weight models are really starting to kick the frontier models, and the shins. And it'll be a fun. I think a year from now, it'll be more of a toss up. I think the frontier models really have to push pretty hard at this point to get some distance from where the open weight models are today.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this topic of like the tension between open models versus the frontier lab models is something that you've talked about a number of times in the past. I think you've also asked like Anthropic's Nicholas Carlini, is that right? About like this idea of, if a model were to generate a 0 day, should they have to report it? Do you have any updates in terms of, your thoughts here, how that feeds into your general thoughts about like these frontier lab closed models versus the open ones?
Sure. I mean, it's kind of funny. If you look at the MSS in China, for example, they've got a requirement saying if you find a vulnerability at a Chinese company, you have to report it to MSS first. That's just part of the model now. So if you're doing a hackathon at Tencent or Alibaba, you now have to basically report all those vulns directly to the government. This is the first thing you do. You're starting to see a little echo of that in the US now as well. They're trying to say, well, you can only use Fable 5 or Mythic if the government allows you to do it, if you're a trusted person and so on. But again, they've all kind of lost the plot, which is that those people are not the gatekeepers. Those tools are not the gatekeepers. They have no control over this. At this point, the cat's already in the bag and everyone's already doing everything they want to be doing. So in a lot of ways, like it doesn't really matter what anybody at a large lab says anymore because end of the day, people are just going to do it. So a good example of that, there's a gentleman who went by, let's see, I don't remember the name of the repo offhand, but a GitHub repo got created about, I don't know, a week ago. And he's been dumping 0 day and random products every single day in a giant pile. No notice, no correlating vendors, just here's new vulnerability, here's new 0 day, have fun. I'm enjoying it. So I think that's the point we're in. It's become so easy to find vulnerabilities that we can no longer pretend we can gatekeep them or control them. It's just a fact of life. So, it'll be interesting to see where it goes, but I think all the panic happening at the government level is misplaced because it's kind of too late.
For sure, and this is actually not part of the original, question scripts, but I am personally interested. You've mentioned a little bit on government level, and when we think about security on the level of nation states, how do you feel about, situations in which like the rules of engagement are no longer relevant, where they're no longer respected? And, how do you expect like the United States defense industry to be able to, I guess, either protect our own assets against foreign actors or maybe vice versa?
The
Let me
US
know if
is
that's not something that you're typically, I guess, like
talking
speaking of.
about something I think about a lot. If you look at if you trust what people say about attribution for different state actors, you see North Korea just stealing all the crypto money. That's what they do all day. They just fund their government with other people's crypto bets. That's how they work. But if you look at like what attacks get attributed to China, a lot of them are like the assault typhoons or whatnot, where it's not a get into a system and start crashing things or taking me over. It's kind of a get in and kind of wait, get positioned to be able to do something in the future. I think those kinds of attacks are kind of dated. I don't think we're going to be able to get there anymore. I think the reason why that type of approach, which as far as I know is not the way the Western governments look at that, they don't want to proactively break into a university. They would rather just have a capability they can turn on when they need to. They don't want to go proactively violate laws to be able to do this, where other actors are okay doing that. So I think kind of where we're ending up is a very different world where the entire internet as we know it is in a really small fishbowl. It's being monitored by everybody. You can go to Shodan.io, you can go to Census, and if you want to figure out anything about any company anywhere, you already have a giant inventory of everything they have. So we're all living in this kind of like fishbowl of what exposures we have from the security side. And that's all you need to then say, great, let me take an LLM and point it at this technology stack, this product, this whatever. And then effectively you can create yourself a golden key. So whenever you need to, you can always take out the key and open the door and walk into that particular company, business organization. You don't have to pre-position yourself into the environment to do it. So that's my take and kind of where I think the world is going is that you're going to see less of these like long term, break in and wait attacks and more of everyone being completely queued up at any given moment to be able to turn the key. Like every time you upgrade your web server, someone at some government agency is going to notice that, modify their exploit, get it tuned up, keep track where you are, and say, "Great, we need to get into this asset, this company, this whatever. Here's how it all lines together. Let's go grab the exploit. We happen to have that one on a fly and go." So it's going to be more of a like just-in-time compromise model than the kind of pre-positioning model that we've been seeing for the last few years.
Yeah, for sure. And I think something that's this topic is also very relevant to 1Password, which is sponsoring our current event today. They also just did the Apono acquisition, which is, a lot of just-in-time things going on. And I guess, like, going back to your current work, you've talked a bit about runZero, like, sort of platformization, things like that. Just as, I think quick things. One, what's been the largest, I guess, technical challenge with runZero? Two, what's been the biggest, I guess, achievement you felt with runZero? And three, I guess, like, don't have to say anything sensitive, but what are you most looking forward to?
Okay, sure. I mean, the biggest challenge I think in our space, a lot of folks don't think about is that we do a few things. We find every asset, every service, everything in an organization really quickly. And the way we do that is kind of magic, right? We don't take credentials. We don't really need connectors. We just go figure it out through like live network traces, active scanning, and so it's like 10,000 hackers in a trench coat pretending to be asset inventory. Like we use this giant bag of tricks that are not particularly well known. And so oftentimes someone will like a product will get patched and that'll break our fingerprinting because we've been depending on this information leak for 5 years to be able to fingerprint that thing remotely. It's a good example is like your iPhones. We had a way to determine when someone had last unlocked their iPhone and exactly what version it was on the network unauthenticated. And we just did that for like 5 years. And eventually Apple's like, oh, we're going to fix that. It's like, okay, great. We have to go find another way to figure out what that iPhone is. But like, it's those kind of things where it's not really exploit development, but it is very much like lots of information leaks. So like our biggest win is being able to take a million different small information leaks and turn that into a very coherent, very detailed, very accurate inventory without the customers really like even knowing how. They're like, how did you do that? It's like, well, that's the whole point, right? It's a mix of like, looking at the noise and looking at the white space between different fingerprints. But the biggest challenge we have is when we do synthesization of like inventory across multiple sources. So we'll be getting like, Tenable scan data, we'll be getting Qualys data, we'll be getting CrowdStrike data, Microsoft Defender, inventory from some IPM system. And they're all wrong and they're all on different timescales. So we'll get a vuln scan, but that vuln scan was done 2 weeks ago on a network where all the IPs have already changed. And at the same time, we'll be getting a list of CrowdStrike reports, but only the last 45 days of seen data. So you're no longer just trying to like match up an asset to an asset or a device to device. You're looking at this from like all four dimensions of time. You have to kind of like rejigger and say, okay, well, this was found before this date, before this IP, before this other thing. So it's an incredibly complex like mash and merge and deduplication process, and you can't get it wrong because if you duplicate an asset, then the customer is going to say, well, I've got two of these things, not one of these things. That's going to affect all their stats for what they do around the security program. And if you overmerge, you put two devices together that are not the same one, same problem. You're now saying you have less of these things than you expect. And so you have to be absolutely accurate, even given garbage data in everywhere. So it's one of those things where like our product is probably most accurate without anyone else's data in it. Just by point and shoot scans are probably the more accurate. As soon as you start adding third party data, we have to really fight hard to keep things clean and to prevent things from being mangled in fun ways. So it's strange. It's kind of strange to say that the more data you get, the lower the quality bar. But in a lot of ways, it's true because the data sources we get are not particularly clean and they tend to contradict things we already have.
Wow, thank you so much for walking us through that. I think like there's so many things that in terms of like this long tail of problems that I think for many years and decades, at least in the world of cybersecurity, as you mentioned earlier in your in this conversation, it's just like people have been, oh, you pick and choose, but now it's very much like you have to be comprehensive. And I guess so. Let's transition a bit to a fun segment before we kind of wrap back to the conclusion and kind of the takeaways here. But fun segment is hot takes. So, do you have any hot takes you'd like to share with the audience? Putting you on the
You've
spot.
already I probably already spilled the beans there, but I think if you're working on a harness right now or harness framework, you're probably wasting your time, unfortunately. I feel like if you know, go into a coma for 6 months and pop back out again, you'd realize all that work wasn't very helpful just because the models are moving fast enough. It's very difficult for a harness built today to be super relevant 6 months from now. And so, I mean, it's okay if you're not spending a lot of time on it, you're building a harness just as kind of a generic plug-in, do whatever, that's great. But if you're like putting all of your eggs behind our harness is better than everybody else, that's why our product is good, you're going to struggle to differentiate in 6 months.
For sure. Actually, at AGI House, we had a build day recently that was on this topic. Just the idea of like, oh, people spent so long, talking about harnesses, building harnesses, and then suddenly, like, these studies come out where it's like, oh, actually, if you cut all that, it works better. Just because the models have gotten so good. And I think like into the last part, which is kind of, how your work intersects with, this Asian identity build day that we've done today. I think first off, in case you have thoughts here, do you have a thesis, I guess, like thoughts about machine identity, kind of like secrets management, all that, insofar as that may be relevant to the work that you do?
Foreign pastoral like my answer to this, but in general, I don't think we've cracked it. I don't think we have a good answer. Like all our machine identities, even like our so it was a couple of takes. If you look at the way like all the large frontier lab tooling is being built, so Cloud Code, OpenAI, et cetera, they're all moving to a model where the authentication happens at the kind of proxy layer. So individual users are not authenticating one on one to whatever, right? You're doing kind of machine to machine identity authentication at the top level, and then you're issuing tokens that are temporary to each user. So there's a new spec that just got added to the MTP spec for doing authentication that way. So it's no longer users authenticating individually to services. It's like your MCP proxy effectively handling token minting for authenticated connection. So that's very much like I think where one password fit in terms of like minting those tokens, tracking all that stuff. But the challenge is once the token is minted, you can't really control it. So it's one of those things where like, once everyone talks about OAuth being a great authentication mechanism, but all OAuth is a temporary key a long-term key that'll give you a short-term key. So once you have a short-term key, you can almost infinitely extend it by calling the same API. And so it's one of those challenges where like we put all of our trust into the model of these temporary short-term keys or machine-to-machine identities, but once they get stolen, they're still stolen just like anything else. It's kind of like web browsers, right? We spend all this effort putting in proxies, putting identity proxies, putting MFA in, but all it takes is somebody scraping your session cookies and they can steal your session. And we've now seen attackers moving towards stealing your browser sessions, not stealing your passwords because your session's already been authenticated through MFA. And so like you're bypassing all those other levels of authentication just by stealing that temporary session token event instead. So I don't know how to solve that. Like we don't have a place where you have tools like CyberArk, et cetera, where you're constantly re-authenticating or whatnot. But at some point, just you need to be able to trust that the credential that your app was giving is still valid, and you can't put every single request your app makes through a separate filtering proxy or IDS or WAF, if you will. So I don't know how to solve it. I do feel like it's better not to have long term tokens everywhere for sure. I think that's what everyone else agrees on. But I think we still aren't in a situation where our short term tokens and our machine identities are really that particularly safe from being stolen.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess that also says whoever can maybe solve this very large challenge, there's a lot to gain there. And I guess that also, we also want to, open it up towards the builders that we have today. A lot of them are young, a lot of them are hungry and passionate, kind of like in this Wild West world that we're living in. Do you have any, I guess, advice to them, either in terms of places that you think they should look into and build upon, or two, just in more general, like life advice in terms of where to channel their ambition?
A good answer for it, but like, I probably spent my every nights and weekends for 20 something years working on my fun stuff on the side. Sometimes that's turned into a new company, sometimes it's turned into an acquisition. So I've been grateful for that. But funny enough, my day jobs rarely turn into the biggest payoff. So I worked at, three startups in a row. None of them did particularly well. But on side project I was working on while I was at those three startups became a big thing. And almost similar, like runZero started as a side project when I was doing consulting work. Consulting work is great. The team was awesome, but it wasn't going to make me $1 bajillion. But it's like, it's wild. It's kind of like nights and weekends time that'll really be the biggest difference in your long-term, income stream, right? Like your employer is not going to be pushing you to make bajillions of dollars as an employee. You'll have to go build something. You'll have to do something. And nobody wants to, if you're in a situation where working all day long and you get home and you're just burnt out and tired, like that's not going to help you get there. You're not going to be able to make a dent. You're not going to be able to really follow your dreams, your passion, because you'll be wiped out, right? So if you can find a job that overlaps a little bit with what you want to be doing as well, where you're kind of like, double dipping on your efforts. So you can work on some open source code while you're at work. That's great. Because then you can then take, if you happen to leave that job, you can still work on the same open source project later on and pick it up and keep going. So try to build skill sets with your day job and investments in your day job that will actually help you with your kind of long term ambitions for your companies, your projects, et cetera. And I think the trade off there is you don't have much of a life. Like you don't go to parties much. You don't really go outside. Like I have zero social life, and I haven't had one for 30 years. But I have a nice family, and I like what I'm doing. And for me, I get a lot of I'm still up to 3. I'm writing code every night. So for me, that's actually what I enjoy.
It's incredible. Thank you so much. And I think, in the future, if you have any further advice for the community at AGI House, we always welcome you. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Yeah, if you want to get a hold of me, htm.io is the website, and you can find my email there. So I'm pretty chatty and happy to talk about whatever. Thanks again.